Hi everyone, welcome to Talent500 YouTube channel. My name is Kushal Vijay and I'm a software engineer and a content creator on YouTube. Today we'll be learning about the most important Java, AWS and React related questions which can help you to grab job opportunities at senior and intermediate level at amazing tech companies. So let's get started without any further ado. Today we'll be discussing about the interview questions that are very frequently asked and very popular for intermediate and senior engineering roles. The interview questions will revolve around Java, React and AWS tech stack. AWS here means Amazon Web Services. So if I talk about the agenda for today, we'll be discussing first the Java advanced questions, then the AWS and then the React. Later on, we'll also discuss what we are going to discuss in the next video, because we are creating a full stack development series and we'll be covering everything that you need to crack interviews for the particular domain. Let's move forward. So we'll be discussing the Java advanced question. First of all, I'll be walking you through to the question that I mentioned here. We'll explain you how to answer those questions in an interview and what things you need to take care while answering those questions. So the first question is, why do we use multi-threading in our application and why not just stick with the main thread? So this is the question that is given to us. Now we need to understand how to answer this question. So the best way to answer such questions is by giving or quoting some examples. It will give the interviewer the hint that you know the concepts in depth. Now, why do we use multi-threading in our application? So some tasks require long time. For example, when you query a database or you fetch some data from the internet, we can do it on the main thread, but in the main thread everything executes synchronously by one. First line of code is executed, then only the second line of code will be executed on the main thread, as it do the things in linear fashion. Now if we'll do some network call or a query the database on the main thread, it will keep on waiting for the data and will not execute the further lines of the code. Now this is the first reason. Now secondly, while the main thread waits for the database query to complete or the data from the internet to be fetched, if you are running that code on a UI application, for user's perspective, the application seems to be stuck or died or frozen or hanged. That will give a very bad experience to the user, as main thread execute each and every line in a linear fashion. That particular moment will appear to the user as hanged screen or died screen, and that is the reason where multi-threading comes in, where we use background threads, the processes which takes a long time, so that the user will not feel any interference and further lines of the code can be executed simultaneously, which will free the main thread, and this process is called multi-threading. Now multi-threading allows us to take input from the user or report any progress to the user by running all the long time taking tasks in the background. Hope you understand how to answer such a question by taking examples and explaining thoroughly. Let's move on to our next question, which is, what do you understand by synchronization and how does it benefit in multi-threading? We have already studied what is multi-threading. Now we need to know what is synchronization. Now in your Java code, for example, there is some function or there's some resource which is shared among multiple, maybe multiple classes are calling that particular function. Now as I mentioned, in multiple threading you can run multiple background threads to use that particular shared resource. Now synchronization will help you to control the access to that particular shared resource. For example, you don't want multiple threads to execute that piece of code at one time. You just want one thread to execute that piece of code. This is where synchronization comes in. Synchronization help you to control access of multiple threads to shared resources. In Java, you can synchronize methods or statements, and when you synchronize a method, only a single thread can run it at one time or execute it at one time. Now how does it benefit in multi-threading? So if a thread is using a synchronized method, all the other threads who want to consume that same method or any other synchronized method initiated in the same class will get suspended until the current thread will run through or completes the process or completes the code walkthrough. Now how does it benefit in multiple threading? Let me explain you with an example. For example, you have a map or hash map in your Java code where multiple threads are writing and reading the information from. Now for example, XYZ is a key and you're trying to write the same key value same key value using multiple threads, and you want to, for if multiple threads will consume the same method at the same time, there could be a chance where a problem can occur where two threads will be writing in the same memory allocation or same value, which can cause exceptions, right? So synchronization help us to execute a piece of code by one thread at a time, and that's why it is very beneficial in multi-threading. Let's move on to our next question, which is what is session tracking and what are the common methods used for session tracking? So how would you explain this question to the interviewer is by explaining what is a session first of all. Now what is a session? Whenever you visit a website or on daily basis, for the specific interval of time you stays on the website, it is used for tracking and maintaining users data for that particular time frame is actually a session. Now what is session tracking? Session tracking is basically a mechanism by which the web container or the websites, the mechanism they use to maintain the state of the user, what the user is doing currently. For example, user is authenticated. What is the current state of the user? It's tracked, and that is tracked using the session tracking. Now why it is being tracked? You need to explain it in this manner. Because HTTP and web servers are stateless protocols, and all the requests and responses that are made to the servers are independent in nature. That is, every request that is made to the web server is treated as a new request or a new session. In order to prevent this, we basically maintain the state of the user, and in order to maintain the state of the user, session tracking is used. Now, every time you make a request to the server, you are on the server, you call the authentication service, or maybe you're on a e-commerce website to try to call the payment service. Every time you make a network request, it will be treated as a new request because responses and requests are independent. Therefore, in order to maintain the state of the user, session tracking is being consumed. In simple terms, session tracking is used to know or to recognize if the request is made by the current user or not, or is the user same for both the request that comes to the server. Now there are multiple methods which are used for session tracking. You might be aware of some of these terminologies already. First is cookies. You might have seen whenever you go to website, they ask for accept all cookies or reject all cookies or accept necessary cookies at least, or HTTP sessions, hidden form fields, where sometimes hidden form fields can appear in the web URL only with query parameters, and then URL rewriting. So these are some of the methods which you can tell the interviewer for session tracking. Moving to our fourth question, which is what is the main disadvantage of using garbage collectors in Java? So before explaining this question, you need to know what is garbage collection, right? So garbage collection is nothing but the mechanism by which the Java language maintains the memory. And this particular question is very frequently asked, very commonly asked in interviews for intermediate and senior engineering roles. So you should be aware of the garbage collection algorithms, the garbage collection concepts. But for the scope of this question, we just need to answer what is the main disadvantage of using the garbage collectors in Java. So as I earlier mentioned, garbage collectors has the job to maintain the memory. So they keep on monitoring or keep on checking if there are any objects which aren't referenced or which are no longer needed. And these garbage collectors keep on running their processes in the background to free up memory for the new objects to be initialized. Now in doing so, in monitoring the objects that aren't referenced or no longer needed for new objects to be initialized, in doing so, this also requires some thread, and it increases the load on the system and delays execution. Similarly, when garbage collectors are used, it's get difficult to implement different garbage collection algorithms like mark and sweep. So let's jump on to our next topic, which is AWS, Amazon Web Services. We'll be walking through some amazing important questions which you need to know, which you should know in order to pass through senior level engineering interviews for full stack development roles. So the first question is, how does Amazon Route 53 provide high availability and low latency? Now you can be blank for this question if you don't know what is Amazon Route 53. You need to know the most common services that a website or a full stack development engineer should know. So you should be aware of all those services provided by AWS. Amazon Route 53 is a DNS web service by the AWS. Now the question is asking, how does it provide high availability and low latency? So the first point is globally distributed servers. So whenever there is a request from any customer, or whenever a customer from around the globe queries this service, that particular request reaches to the nearest DNS server, which is local to them basically, which provide them low latency. Since there are so many servers around the globe, the request goes to the nearest DNS server and serves the request to the client, and hence results in low latency. The second is dependability. Route 53 is highly reliable, highly dependable service, which is very beneficial for critical application as it avoids point of failure. Then comes optimal locations. So AWS has their Route 53 servers around the globe at strategic locations, and that too they cache the data based on the configuration and the requirement for that particular region. And due to the global presence, Route 53 allow to serve the request to any client with the nearest data center. Now even so, there could be a possibility that the same data is replicated into multiple data centers, but Route 53 makes sure that the client will be served from the nearest data center, so that there will be low latency, and hence the user's request will be served in efficient time or less time. Let's move on to our next question, which is, what are the consistency models for modern databases offered by AWS? Now consistency means you need to have accurate data whether you fetch from DB1 or DB2. Consistency should be there in the data that is there stored in those databases. There are two types of consistencies that AWS provides. One is eventual consistency and the other is strong consistency. So you need to answer the question away. First of all, briefly explain consistency and then the type of consistencies. So the first is eventual consistency. Now let's understand this consistency with an example. In a Twitter or Facebook feed, you don't need the new tweets or the new post as soon as they get uploaded on the internet. It's fine, you don't need them in real time. Similarly, in eventual consistency, the data will be consistent in some time, but it may not be immediate. It may take some time, but it will be consistent eventually. Now how this particular consistency, how it is advantageous, we need to mention a few points around that as well. So basically it helps us to serve the request faster. It may be possible that initial few requests could be stale or returns the older data, but eventually things will get consistent after some request. Then it is preferred in applications where real-time data is not required, as I already mentioned, tweets on Twitter or post notifications on Facebook. Then comes the second kind of consistency, which is strong consistency, which provide you immediate consistency or immediate data replication across the servers. Now since this particular model is providing you immediate consistency, this model may take some time to make the data consistent and subsequently start serving the request again. So initially when there is a change in database, so it may take some time to make the data consistent across DBs, and then as soon as it does it, it will start providing the request or start serving the request. This particular model guarantees that all the responses available will have the consistency in data, but as you know, in eventual consistency, for the initial few requests, the data you might get stale data. So this is the difference between both the DB models. Let's move on to our next question. So the next question is, what is stateful and stateless firewall? So as a full stack developer, you need to know what a firewall is. So firewall is basically a monitoring system which maintains or monitors the traffic, incoming and outgoing traffic on the network. So that is a firewall. Now there are two types of firewalls, which are stateful firewall and a stateless firewall. You need to explain each of them and explain the difference between both of them. So while explaining different types of firewall, you need to convey your knowledge, or you need to convey your thoughts in a similar manner, differentiating between the two on the way. For example, so a stateful firewall is nothing but a firewall which maintains the state of the rules defined. So you need to define some inbound rules which will monitor the incoming and outgoing traffic which is coming to your network. In this, you just need to define the inbound rules, and based on the inbound rules, it automatically allows the outbound rules to flow. Since we talked about inbound and outbound rules, you need to explain the other firewall type in the similar manner. In a stateless firewall, it requires you to explicitly define the rules for inbound as well as outbound. Now this particular statement directly clarifies the difference between the two and also explain what both of them means. In stateful, you just need to define the inbound rules. In stateless, you have to define inbound as well as outbound rules for the traffic. Now for example, if you have inbound traffic from port 80 or port 443, the stateful firewall will allow outbound traffic to port 80, but the stateless won't. So I hope you understand the difference between the two. Let's move on to our next question, which is what is an AWS Lambda and why is it recommended to spin an AWS Lambda without any virtual private cloud? Now you might have heard about this term Lambda, which is a service provided by AWS. So if you are a full stack developer and consuming cloud computing, you need to be aware of the services provided by the particular cloud provider. So you need to explain it in a manner. What is Lambda? So there are multiple types of architecture, which is microservices, monoliths, and serverless. So Lambda is basically a serverless computing architecture which is provided by Amazon Web Services, and it is also event driven. Now what does that mean? So for example, your Lambda, get some events, run some code. Now for example, your Lambda gets some events, it runs some code, and that particular code required computation, that is resources, compute resources. Now when there will be more events, it will require more compute. As soon as the events get reduced, the AWS Lambda manages the resources automatically and make the not consumed resources free. So basically it automatically manages the computing resources required by that code. Now next question, or the part of the question, is so why it is recommended to spin an AWS Lambda without a VPC? Because whenever you assign a virtual private cloud to a Lambda, under the hood it assigns a elastic network interface to that particular instance. Now assigning that ENI to that instance will take time, and this will increase the latency. Now increasing the latency in delivering the results will obviously affect the user experience and the performance of the website. Hence it is not recommended. I hope you understood the question. Now let's move on to our next topic, which is for React. We'll be discussing some important questions of the React, and I will explain you how to answer those in an interview. So our first React question is, what are the differences between a class component and a functional component? The way you should explain this question is you will be talking about the class component first and then moving ahead to functional component, talking about similar properties that you talked in one of the components. So if we talk about class components, the first point is it uses ES6 class syntax, and it makes use of the lifecycle methods, and it is extended from the React.component library. Furthermore, this keyword is used to access the props and functions that you declare inside the class components. So we actually talked about 4 things here about class component. First is ES6 class syntax. It makes use of lifecycle methods. It is a part of the component extends from the React.component library, and it uses this keyword to access props and functions. Whereas functional components are much simpler as compared to class-based functions, because they focus more on the UI of the application instead of the behavior or the processing or the logic. Precisely, in a class component, rendering part is done via the render functions. Like the rendering thing is done by functional components only. Further, functional components can have state and mimic lifestyle events using the React hooks. Moving on to our next question, which is, what are the advantages of using React hooks? Now, in order to explain this answer, first you need to know what are React hooks, and you need to have an understanding. So before moving on to explaining the advantages, first you should brief about what a hook is. So hook is nothing but a simple JavaScript function which is extracted out from a functional component in order to reuse it. If you go through the definition, basically it enables the extraction and reuse of stateful logic that is common across multiple components. And how does it help? Basically without the burden of higher order components or render props. Now moving on to the advantages, they help us manipulate the state of a functional component without making it without converting it to a class component. So they help us to manipulate the function component without even converting into a class component. Further, hooks allow you to avoid using lifecycle methods because you can use built-in hooks like use effect. So hooks don't work inside classes because they let you use React without classes. So here is one of the major advantages of it, that you don't have to use lifecycle methods and can consume the built-in methods. Moving on to our next question of React, which is what are the lifecycle methods of ReactJS class components? Now this question, you need to explain each and every bit of the lifecycle methods in a ReactJS class component. For example, the first is component will mount. It is executed before rendering and used for app level configuration in your root component. Second is component did mount, which is executed after first rendering. All the Ajax requests, DOM and states updates and setup event listeners occur here only. Third is component will receive props. It is executed when particular prop updates trigger state transitions. Fourth is should component update. Basically it determines if a component will be updated or not. And by default it returns true. This particular method is a great way to improve performance. How? If you are sure that you don't need to render after the state of props are updated, you can return a false value. It will prevent the re-render if the component receives a new prop, because you will return a false value because you know you don't need another render. Then fifth is component will update. It is executed before re-rendering the component when there are props and state changes, confirmed by should component update. If the should component update returns a true, then this particular component will update will be executed before re-rendering that component. Then comes component did update. Mostly used to update the DOM in response to prop and state changes. So whenever the prop and state changes, it is used to update the DOM. Then comes the final one, which is component will unmount. It is used to cancel any ongoing network request, remove all event listeners associated with the component. So it basically clears everything which is ongoing. The network request, it removes all the listeners attached to that particular component. Moving on to our next question, which is what is the difference between a ShadowDOM and a VirtualDOM? And now here you need to be aware of the DOM. What is a DOM? What is the DOM component and stuff? So DOM is nothing but document object model, which is the structured representation of HTML code. Now talking about the differences, so VirtualDOM actually helps to avoid unnecessary changes to a DOM. Whenever there is a change happens, re-rendering will happen. Now in order to avoid re-rendering, VirtualDOM is very helpful, and this actually helps since re-rendering is a very expensive operation, it will also help to improve the performance as well. Further, it allows to collect several changes and then apply it at once instead of applying every single change. Further, it also allows to collect several changes and to be applied at once instead of applying each and every single change, which causes re-rendering. It happens in one go, so that all the set of changes applied to the DOM at once. So then comes ShadowDOM, which basically encapsulates the implementation. That is, a single custom element can implement more or less complex logic combined with more or less complex DOMs. So multiple complex DOMs can be combined to create some complex logic. For instance, you can take an entire web application of arbitrary complexity that can be added to a page by just a single import, as you can see the syntax here. And not just complex components, you can even create simpler reusable and composable components like date picker. You can create them as custom elements where the internal representation will be hidden in the ShadowDOM, and you can use them by just an import in any of the page that you have. So I hope you understand the difference between ShadowDOM and VirtualDOM. So this is it for this video. We'll be discussing what you can expect next. We'll be discussing each and every bit end-to-end, what, how and whys around NoSQL and SQL databases. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video and learned something out of it. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and like the video as well for more amazing updates or for the next videos. We'll be sharing more videos around, as I have already mentioned, the next topic we are going to discuss. We'll be covering the full stack domain in multiple videos, so make sure you stay tuned for the updates. And if you have any doubts, make sure you put them in the comments. We'll meet you in the next video. Bye bye. Take care.